About 3 weeks later, detectives found her remains in the woods.
Listen, though, I need the truth right now. Your only last chance to tell me the truth.
This is the honest truth. I'm scared right now. I didn't do this.
When you interrogate someone, you don't know what they're going to do when they're faced with pressure.
You're lying. Quit lying. He was only admitting to what he couldn't deny and denying what we couldn't prove.
I didn't do anything.
He's only capable of one thing, and that is rage.
He's unpredictable, and he wants people to fear him.
He is banging his head as hard as he possibly can on the interrogation table. Wow, you're really crazy.
I am Michelle Selig. I was a homicide detective back in 2012 for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. As a detective, I was in child abuse and in sex crimes. 4 years of sex crimes really wears on you, and it was time for me to move on and make change. So homicide was the only step up from there. And I thought I was good enough to be in the elite club. It's rare for females to go to homicide, and it's definitely rare for females to stick around in homicide. Once I proved myself and proved my work ethic and solved my first whodunit case, I gained a lot of respect from the guys, and I stayed in that unit for 10 years. So in mid-November, I was just in the office working a normal day, and I got a phone call that missing persons detectives had been working a case for a little over a month of a missing woman named Sherry Prather.
The last time anyone saw Sherry Prather was October 12th. Her family reported her missing 3 days later.
Well, Sherry was my only child. I raised her by myself. She was just the love of my life. This was Sherry. We took this on Wednesday, and the next day is when she disappeared.
The missing persons detectives received a tip that Sherry's body was off of Braddock Road.
So they called us out saying, hey, we just want to get y'all on board. So if we find her, you know, you've already stepped into the case.
Braddock Road retains a lot of that rural look. You can go for a half mile in some directions and there's nothing but two-lane road and pine woods on either side.
You look at what you're supposed to be searching, it's overwhelming. It's a daunting task. How are we going to find anything in this?
Nobody could find her remains, so we had to call out a cadaver dog.
They thoroughly searched that area for several hours, and you begin to believe this is never going to happen. We're not going to find anything of value. And suddenly the dog alerts, sits down and barks.
And then there's this skull shining in the middle of it all.
We now know this is more than a rumor. There's a dead human here. So when one human bone is discovered, a search of a wider area begins. They find a pair of shoes. They find a shirt. They find more bones.
The bones look weathered, like they've been out there for a while. Florida weather will do that with the sun, the heat, the humidity.
There is some level of decomposition that occurs in a month's time, of course. But the real issue is carnivore involvement.
All the flesh had been picked away. That particular area of Braddock Road, there was quite a bit of scavengers out there.
Matter of fact, a pelvic bone was found up in a tree where an animal probably skirted up the tree.
So this is a tragic mess.
So they have a collection of bones. Do they belong to Sherry Prather? Or is it someone else I don't even know about?
The remains were taken to the medical examiner's office. They identified her as Sherry Prather.
We were able to do that through some dental records. And then more importantly, you really have to determine what the cause of death was. And that is a critical piece.
Skeletal remains can speak to you if you listen.
We had a forensic anthropologist from the University of Florida come in. And they found what appeared to be a half-moon indentation in one of the ribs. And then a fragmentation of one of her vertebrae that indicated that she was shot in the back.
At that point, we knew it was a homicide.
So now it's different. It's no longer a missing person, it's a dead person. And they were murdered. And homicide detective Michelle Salick is on the case. And she is not going to walk away from this.
I just felt like, okay, this is it. I gotta solve this case.
The first step is to notify the survivors.
When I look back, I really don't know how I got through it. To know that she laid out there and those animals ripped her apart. And that was the hardest thing that I could process.
You know, Sherry Lee Prather was seen as a happy person who sang her way through life. She had 2 daughters. She had a mother who cared for her. She had friends.
She loved motorcycles. She was a great singer. She loved to go all over doing karaoke. She loved to party. She could walk in any place, and wherever she went, when we left there, she was friends with everybody. She was just a real loving person.
I really wanted to find justice for Norma Ellis for, the death of her daughter. And I read all the reports involved in this case. I found out that Sherry Prather was last seen alive on October 12th, 2012, leaving a bar on the north side called Boots and Bottles.
Boots and Bottles was known as a local bar, kind of like a pool hall. It had a reputation of being a little rowdy at times, sometimes guys riding motorcycles.
The night she disappeared, Sherry's mother drops her off at Boots and Bottles for a ladies' night out.
And then by the next day, she hadn't called, she hadn't showed up. I knew something was wrong.
So it got assigned to the missing persons unit. They started following up some pretty good leads.
During these interviews, her friends report that Sherry had been very distressed that day because she broke up with her boyfriend, so she wanted to go out and have a few drinks. They all said that Sherry was a little tipsy that evening. She was invited to a party at a private home on Trout River Road, which is in the area. They said she met a guy in the bar who's a biker. And she asked him for a ride to this party. She gets on the back of a motorcycle that belongs to a stranger. He fires it up and roars off into the night. The last thing they see is the taillight of a motorcycle.
They drive off, and nobody sees him again.
So who is that on the motorcycle with Sherry? Is he the reason she was reduced to bones?
Police identified human remains found in this wooded area last week as Sherry Prather.
Prather was celebrating a girls' night out with her friends at Boots and Bottles on North Main Street.
Now, this is a biker bar. They don't have any surveillance tapes on purpose. But across the street, there's another place of business that does.
And it showed our victim getting on the back of a motorcycle.
It clearly shows Sherry Prather with a male individual and driving away.
We just know he was a white male. You know, it appeared that he was bald. And it would have been hard to know exactly who that was.
You can't see the biker's face, but you can clearly see the motorcycle. The fact that he's riding on a Honda is an enormous clue. Now, in biker world, that is a felony. If you're not riding a Harley Davidson, you're not considered to be a biker. So who is this guy? So Selig goes to visit the bar to determine if they can learn who the biker is that Sherry left with. They make contact with a bartender. Detective Selig says, "Did you know a guy who rides a Honda that comes here all the time?" "Oh, yeah. His name is Johnny Johnson. He's the only guy that rides a Honda at that bar."
What they said about Johnny Wayne Johnson is he's rough. His nickname is Viking, and that's what he went by, and that he's from Iceland. And he's unpredictable.
Unpredictable enough to kill? Let's find out. So they track down the Icelandic Viking, and by all accounts, he is true to his name.
He's a white male, pale, red beard. He's a big man. He's very large.
He looked like a Viking. He should have had a hatchet or a warhammer or something.
He said his name in America is John Johnson, but in Iceland, his name is Magni Thorvaldsson. He speaks with an Icelandic accent. It is slight, but it is audible. He is asked, how did he meet Sherry? He's extremely cooperative. And he replies that it was that night at Boots and Bottles. Sherry said she needs a ride to a party on Trout River Road, so he agrees to take her there.
He didn't deny that that was Sherry Prather on the back of his motorcycle.
Viking says they drive to Trout River Road. They stop where this house is. Sherry says, let me go inside and talk to people, and then I'll get you in.
He said she went inside this house. I saw people looking out the window. It was a little sketchy, so I didn't know if I was going to get robbed. And so I left, and I didn't see her again after that.
The odds would say there was some encounter at this party that resulted in her untimely demise.
Viking rode with us, pointed out, this is the way we went. This is where I dropped her off.
Selig goes up and knocks and gets no reply. She looks in the windows and decides this place has certainly seen better days. It's all in very poor condition. She inserts a business card in the door frame with her name and her phone number.
At that point, we had to find something else.
The major question here, who did Sherry run into at this party? Somebody she knows? Somebody that hates her? Sherry's friends told the missing persons detectives that she'd been in a dispute with her boyfriend.
Well, earlier that day, she went over to his apartment and they got into an argument. And she made him bring her home, and the whole time coming home, they were in an argument.
So when someone says to me in a homicide case, well, she's got this boyfriend, Oh, I like boyfriends. What's his story? It turns out the boyfriend's name is Daniel Dollison.
I didn't approve of him. He was real jealous of Sherry. And I always felt like he was parked in the parking lot or across the street watching who she left with, because I knew what type of person he was.
Well, what if Mr. Dollison follows Sherry to this party on Trout River Road? And the argument continues with alcohol involved and maybe a gun? Could that work? Oh boy, yeah, it could. We've been wondering if Sherry had run into someone at this house party. Could it have been her boyfriend, Daniel Dollison, that she ran into? And the arguments continued. Detectives find Daniel Dollison quite easily. He's not concealing himself anywhere. They asked him directly, "You had an argument that day. What was it about?" "Well, I wanted her to move in with me." And she said, "Absolutely not. Her mother was advancing in age. She planned on taking care of her."
She took care of me and my 2 granddaughters. 4 girls living together in one house.
So did you go to this house party on Trout River Road and run into Sherry there? No, I did not. I went to my sister's house to talk about Sherry refusing to move in with me, and I spent the night there.
And he said, I didn't go down Braddock Road that night. I'd never been down Braddock Road before.
The alibi checks out completely. Dollison had nothing to do with her disappearance or her death. He loves that girl. Now he knows he will never see her again.
It's terrible to imagine that, you know. I wanted to protect her from all that, you know, and I couldn't be there. There won't be no closure for me until I see him fried in the electric chair.
So Selig is back to square one. Where do we go now?
At that point, I was starting to kind of run into a dead end.
Then she hears back from the people that own the house in the woods on Trout River Road, where she left her business card.
They were just, a normal mid-age, couple. They were back and forth because they were renovating the house.
They've never had a party in that house. The place has never been broken into.
They were kind of just taken back of the whole story of why I even called them. They never heard a motorcycle. They don't know anything about a Sherry Prather.
2 things become obvious to Selig after this meeting with these people. There's never been a party in this place, and the person who said there was is lying through his teeth, and his name is John Johnson, also known as Viking. The only possibility for Johnny to be lying is he's involved in her death.
At that point, he was a potential suspect, for sure.
So now, Selig has someone to refocus upon. All she knows about him is what he claims. He's Icelandic. He's 39 years old. His occupation is long-distance truck driver.
I found out he spent time for a violent felony in Georgia.
She also learns that Johnny Johnson has an ex-wife named Samantha.
I decided, you know what? Let's reach out to Johnny Wayne's ex-wife.
When you're speaking to the wife or a girlfriend, there is a tendency to protect their loved one from you. Ex-wives don't defend. Ex-wives attack.
My name is Samantha Burleson. In 2008, I met Johnny Wayne Johnson at a friend's birthday party. There was this guy that just kept staring at me. Kind of the bad boy image and quiet and mysterious. I was just getting out of a bad marriage for something new and exciting. But John changed as soon as we said I do. He went from a happy-go-lucky guy to somebody who literally terrified me. It was always mostly verbal threats. If you don't do this, I'm gonna hurt you. We separated in October of 2011. We stayed in contact because he still wanted to be there for my kids.
My first impressions of Samantha was that she really wanted to cooperate, but she was terrified of Johnny Wayne. She wanted to tell us everything, but she was so nervous, and I can understand why. Sherry Prather went missing early morning of October 12th. Samantha Burleson told me a few days later, Johnny called her and asked to meet her at a park.
He started asking me these weird questions. He goes, what would you do or how would you get rid of a person's body? I was just laughing and joking because I thought he was joking. He said, Braddock Road, that's where she's at. And I was like, what are you talking about? Who's there? That's where she's at, but don't worry about it. I'm gonna take care of it. I thought it was full of I thought he was trying to scare me.
Samantha says that Viking is a pathological liar. He can't help himself but to lie constantly to try to establish his persona as a mysterious and dangerous biker.
Johnny Wayne thrives off attention from people, so he wanted attention.
This guy kept building himself up to everybody that would listen. Hey, I'm a badass, don't cross me. I'm to be feared and respected.
Samantha assumed it was another one of his fantasies.
But when they found Sherry in the woods on Braddock Road, I did not, for the life of me, want to say anything. I was so scared.
Like all homicide detectives, Selig wants to build the strongest possible case against Viking, so she comes up with a plan that has some promise.
We asked Samantha to wear a wire and meet up with Johnny Wayne in hopes that he would, again, talk about what he did to Sherry Prather that night.
That is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. This is a person she is admittedly afraid of, but she agrees to try this.
I wasn't hesitant because Sherry had a family. She had people that cared about her. That's why I did what I did.
She wanted to help so bad because she wanted him to pay for what he did.
Viking is a little bit of a mechanic, so Selig tells Samantha to call and ask Viking to check out her truck to get the conversation started.
I placed the wire in my bra. I kept worrying that he was gonna either find it or I was gonna lose it. I felt like everything was resting on my shoulders. It was just terrifying.
So we have a plan in place to catch our man Viking into confessing to the crime of murder. Is it going to work? Well, we're about to find out. Samantha has agreed to wear a wire, which is an extremely brave thing to do.
It was at his mom's garage at her house, and I was really hoping, like, okay, we're gonna get this guy.
Having to wear a wire and confront somebody by yourself, you don't know if your next breath is gonna be your last, if they're gonna find out that you were wearing a wire and betraying them. It's terrifying.
How you doing?
The truck, it's whining really bad, John. Can you put more power steering fluid in?
Yeah. All right.
So when he takes a look at her truck, she subtly shifts the conversation to Sherry's murder.
Okay, tell me the story.
Nothing happened. I dropped her off on Trout River. But nobody's gonna ask you anyway.
I said, you sure you're not in trouble, are you? He goes, just drop it. But what really happened?
Right now, I don't want to really get into it until it's over with. You understand what I'm saying?
Every time she brought it up, he would basically shush her and say, we're not talking about that. I just think he was starting to get paranoid.
And all of a sudden, it dawns on his pea-sized brain that maybe me running my mouth was a bad idea. So Samantha breaks the contact.
She tried her hardest. I mean, she really, really tried.
When they thanked me for doing that, but I feel like I was letting the police officers down because I didn't get John to say anything on tape. I was disappointed in myself.
Did they get what they wanted? No. But Selig is determined to solve the death of Sherry Prather.
At that point, we knew that Johnny Wayne Johnson was our suspect, but we had to find other means to prove it.
Detective Selig needs a piece of evidence linking Viking to the scene or an eyewitness confession, something more than what she currently has.
We just continued our investigation and followed up on every tip. We talked to everybody possible at Boots and Bottle Bar.
Selig becomes aware that Viking has a current girlfriend whose name is Chelsea Burton.
She was very scared. She was shaking the whole time we were talking to her. You can tell she didn't want to speak to us.
Burton tells the same exact story and sequence of events that Viking told Selig. He had dropped off this girl from the bar at a party on Trout River Road, and he came home at 2 o'clock and he went directly to bed. So what does that do? That provides Viking with an alibi.
She was just giving us enough information to act like she was cooperating, but just really not enough to do anything with.
We were confident she knew more than she was telling us. So part of our strategy was, okay, they may not be willing to speak to us now, but this is going to be something we're going to need to come back to once, twice, maybe 3 times and re-interview these people.
Detective Selig talks to everyone who's ever known or been associated with Viking. You're telling these people you're not going to go away.
I didn't want to give up on this case. It's hard to know who is responsible for the death of somebody and not being able to put them behind bars. And I just wasn't willing to suspend the case and get rid of it.
As her time continues with this tale, Selig becomes aware that Viking is not who he says he is. He says he's an Icelandic man who spent over half his life in Iceland, and he is a descendant of Eric the Red. The reality is, you're not Viking, you're Johnny Wayne Johnson from the trailer parks of Jacksonville, Florida.
He's never even been to Iceland. He doesn't even have a passport.
And your Icelandic accent is bull.
And that's how he was talking the whole time. Just like this. That's not really how he talks. Johnny wants people to fear him. He just likes himself to look bigger and badder. I think that gives him some self-power that he intimidates people.
He would talk about Viking gods and Thor. I mean, it was like the guy was living in a DC comic. The elevator didn't go up to the top floor with this guy.
Johnny Johnson is a pathetic human being. He invents this persona. How sad is that? You are so disgusted by who you are, you want to be someone else. That's very disturbed.
So a couple years goes by, and I decided, you know what? Let's reach out to Johnny Wayne's previous girlfriend again. I heard that they weren't dating anymore, so I thought, you know what? Let's go find her and see if her story changes. We made contact with her, and you would have thought the incident happened 5 minutes before we came there because she was shaking It took a long time to get her on board and to gain her trust, but she ended up talking to us.
She admitted that she did not tell us everything that time because she was in fear of her life. She was scared that he would kill her.
She says that even though I told you he was home by 2 and he went to bed, that's not true. He didn't come home at all. I didn't see him for 2 more days. So Viking's alibi just went up in smoke.
She agreed to tell us what Johnny Wayne Johnson really told her. And that was that he did leave with Sherry Prather on the back of his motorcycle that night, leaving Boots and Bottles. And they did end up on Braddock Road. And apparently he got mad and he shot and killed her and drove her into the woods.
Chelsea says he forced her to go with him to Braddock Road to look for expended casings to recover them from his pistol.
She said that later he threw a gun out of her car window as they were crossing over a body of water.
She said Johnny Wayne threatened her that night in her car.
He told her if she ever told the police, he would kill her in front of her son.
She was terrified, and I can understand why.
So it bought her silence for 2 years. But time changes things, and now she's come forward.
I'm really, really depending on her statement. This was, a case that I never thought we were going to resolve.
So Selig brings Viking into an interrogation room. He's under the gun over something he thought was long forgotten. But the police don't forget, and they don't forgive. So now Viking is in the spotlight, and Selig is standing on his tail.
I was ecstatic. Like, it had been 4 years. Could not wait to hear his story.
Selig is experienced as an interrogator, so she brings Viking into an interrogation room and leaves him alone in that room, and they close and lock the door. Now, who is Viking? This fearful guy with an invented personality. His worst enemy is his mind. He begins to run with it. They leave him alone in that room for almost an hour. Viking looks like he's coming apart at the seams.
He seemed nervous because he started dry heaving into the trash can.
You alright, man? No, I'm so bad. I'm sick.
You sick?
What's wrong with you? I got it coming out the 2 ends. The doctors will be back today to do more blood work. They think I may have cancer.
Johnny, you're clearly lying.
He doesn't have cancer. His emotions are making him sick.
There are 2 different types of homicide suspects. There's the type that's gonna say F you as soon as you walk in the room. They ain't saying nothing. And then there's the type that wants to keep talking because they want to know what you have. Johnny, do you remember a detective talking to you 4 years ago about the girl that was missing from Boots and Bottles?
Yes.
And I said, hey, listen, we just kind of got to recount that story. And he kind of started telling the same story. So, Johnny, you never confessed to your friends that you killed this girl?
She tells him, people you know and have trusted have told us you have confessed to this crime and how you destroyed your gun and threw it in the river.
You're not being honest, Johnny, but you got to explain your side of the story.
And I have been. I dropped her off on Trout River.
But you didn't.
I did.
You took her to Braddock Road.
So initially, when Selig begins her interview with Viking, she's polite and she's nice, and then finally she moves to the next phase. She starts to hammer him.
You're lying. So quit lying.
there's a reason why you're on Braddock Road.
No, I don't even know where Braddock Road is.
Do you think you're going to convince a jury that you don't have nothing to do with that?
I wanted to call him out on his obvious lies with grace.
I didn't do this.
Well, who did?
I don't know who did.
He wasn't volunteering any additional information. He was only admitting to what he couldn't deny and denying what we couldn't prove.
So all these people are lying on you?
Yes.
For what reason?
Yes, I don't know.
He denies everything, so she just ends it. It's over.
Can I go home?
No, you cannot.
Why is that?
Because I'm charging you with murder.
I didn't do murder.
Well, I'm charging you with it, and we can prove it, Johnny.
After about 4 hours of being with Johnny Wayne, I left the room to start my paperwork for my arrest docket. And he stood up. And he violently just took his head and bashed his head into the table.
Why does he bang his head on the table as hard as he does? I don't speak with an Icelandic accent, so therefore I have no idea.
Johnny Wayne is an actor. He loves the attention, hence why he told everybody he killed Sherry Prather.
He's a killer, and now he knows that the police know he is.
We'll take care of it. I didn't do nothing, okay?
After the head-banging incident, EMTs are called. They examine him and make a decision he's probably going to be all right.
After that, I walk him over to the jail, and I book him on the charges of murder, so that felt good. Johnny Wayne did not confess to killing Sherry Prather, but he admitted enough to where it was going to make a positive impact on this case.
Despite not getting a confession, Selig has an opinion as to how Sherry Prather's murder likely unfolded.
I think that once Johnny Wayne Johnson got down Braddock Road with Sherry, he probably was trying to have sex with her. And she probably rejected him.
Clearly, something goes wrong. What that is, no one knows. Something goes south. And death results.
Braddock Road, that's where the body fell. That's where the body was dragged into the woods.
If he never told anybody, never called anybody, never said anything to anybody, he most likely could have got away with it. But he kept talking.
Detective Selig called me. It was about 12 o'clock at night, and she said, "We got him. He's arrested." And I just busted out crying.
Johnny Wayne Johnson was charged with second-degree murder. We thought we were going to actually have to go to trial, which we were ready for.
Yesterday, Sherry Prather's killer pleaded guilty to shooting and killing the mother of two. 43-year-old Johnny Johnson was sentenced to 20 and a half years behind bars.
I was feeling accomplished. Finally, 4 years, and not just hard work, because it's not about me. It's about Sherry. And finally, I was able to bring justice for Sherry Prather's family, and that felt wonderful.
Sherry was just the love of my life. She was part of me, and like even now, I just feel like part of me's missing. This is what I have left to my daughter. There's a vial on the back, and it has her ashes in it. And every time I look at it, the madder I get of what he did, and I wish I'd have killed him. 1,000 times I wish I had just went ahead and killed him. Prison's too good for him. For what he did.
I just feel like he didn't completely lose in this case. I mean, Johnny's still going to be young when he gets out of prison.
Are you going to be worried when he gets out?
I'm not worried of Johnny Wayne Johnson. He doesn't scare me.
Selig is your best homicide detective. Time doesn't stop her. Years don't stop her. Nothing stops her. She seeks the truth, and she finds it. On the next American Detective.
She was last seen at 6:45 at night riding a purple bicycle.
It's every parent's worst nightmare.
Someone took her. Someone is trafficking her.
Who lives in there, and what is his story?
You're saying you've killed before?
Where could she be?
The rain had been falling over London for 3 straight days, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked the pavements, blurred the streetlights, and turned the city into a maze of shadows. On the night of October 17th, 1978, the fog pressed low against the rooftops, wrapping the narrow alleys of East London in a suffocating hush, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Somewhere between the echo of distant sirens and the rumble of late-night buses, a young woman vanished, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions, scattered clues, and a mystery that would haunt Britain for more than 4 decades. Her name was Eleanor Walsh. She was 22 years old, a university student, a part-time waitress, a daughter, a sister, a face known in the neighborhood for its quiet smile and soft-spoken kindness. She lived in a modest brick flat near Whitechapel Road, sharing the space with another student. On most nights, Eleanor returned home before 10, locking the door behind her, making tea, and studying until sleep took her. But on this night, something broke the pattern. Something went terribly wrong. At 9:43 p.m., Eleanor was seen leaving the Blue Lantern Cafe, tying her scarf tighter around her neck, her breath visible in the cold air. She waved goodbye to her coworker, stepped into the mist, and walked toward the underground station. She never arrived. By midnight, her flatmate began to worry. By dawn, the worry turned to panic. And by the next evening, Eleanor Walsh was officially listed as missing. The streets around Whitechapel filled with police. Doors were knocked. Neighbors questioned. CCTV was barely in its infancy, leaving only fragmented glimpses of blurred silhouettes and indistinct motion. The investigation began in urgency, driven by the ticking clock that haunted every missing person case. Because the first 48 hours are everything. And in Eleanor's case, they vanished like smoke. Search teams combed alleyways, abandoned buildings, and canal banks. Dogs traced her scent to the edge of a narrow street near Commercial Road, then stopped abruptly, confused, circling the damp pavement as if her trail had simply dissolved into thin air. There were no screams reported. No witnesses who could say they saw a struggle. No signs of blood. No dropped belongings. Just absence. The city whispered her name for weeks. Posters appeared on lampposts, bus stops, and shop windows. Eleanor's photograph stared out from grainy black and white prints, her eyes frozen in a hopeful expression that slowly began to feel like an accusation. Each day without answers deepened the unease. Because when a person disappears without a trace, the mind fills the void with fear. Her family arrived from Manchester, staying in a cramped hotel, waiting for news that never came. Her mother spent days sitting by the phone, flinching at every ring. Her father walked the same streets again and again, memorizing the cracks in the pavement, hoping repetition might summon a clue from nowhere. Her younger brother stood silently beside him, watching the city swallow his sister whole. Rumors spread fast. Some said Eleanor had run away, chasing dreams of a new life. Others whispered about drugs, secret lovers, underground clubs, and criminal debts. But those who knew her rejected every theory. Eleanor was cautious, careful, predictable. She kept a diary. She planned everything. And in none of her notes, none of her letters, none of her conversations, did she hint at escape. Detectives focused on the route from the cafe to the underground. It was well-lit, busy, lined with shops and late-night traffic. A safe path, or so it seemed. Yet somewhere along those few hundred meters, Eleanor disappeared. A bus driver recalled seeing a young woman matching her description arguing with a man near the corner of Adler Street. The detail was vague, uncertain, fragile as mist. Another witness claimed to have heard a scream shortly before 10, but could not pinpoint its origin. A shop owner mentioned a suspicious van parked illegally near the curb, engine running, its license plate partially obscured by mud. None of these leads held firm. They drifted, slipped, collapsed under scrutiny. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The case grew colder with each unanswered question. And then, 11 months later, a body was found. On the muddy bank of the River Lea, nearly 10 miles from where Eleanor had last been seen, a fisherman noticed something pale tangled among reeds and debris. Police arrived within minutes. The remains were badly decomposed, the face unrecognizable, the clothing torn and soaked. But the scarf was still there. The same scarf Eleanor had worn the night she vanished. The autopsy revealed limited answers. Cause of death: undetermined. Time of death: impossible to establish precisely. The water had erased too much, but there were fractures in the ribs, a crack in the skull, signs consistent with blunt force trauma, and just enough uncertainty to keep every theory alive. Eleanor Walsh was officially declared dead. Her disappearance transformed into a murder investigation, but without witnesses, without forensic technology advanced enough to read the silent language of DNA, and without a clear crime scene, the case began to rot from the inside. Files thickened, leads dried up, detectives were reassigned, and eventually, Eleanor's name slipped quietly into the archive of unresolved crimes. A cold case, but the silence never truly ended. For decades, the story lingered in the background of London's criminal history, surfacing in newspaper retrospectives, late-night radio shows, and whispered conversations among veteran officers. Some believed Eleanor had been the victim of a random predator, a man who vanished as easily as he struck. Others suspected organized crime, human trafficking, or a hidden network of violence operating beneath the city's surface. But belief without proof was nothing more than noise. In 1986, a man was arrested for a series of assaults in East London. His van matched the vague description given years earlier. For a brief moment, hope ignited. But the evidence was circumstantial. No confession. No physical link. He walked free. In 1994, a retired detective reopened the files, convinced he had missed something. He traced every witness, re-examined every statement, reconstructed Eleanor's final hours minute by minute. His conclusion was chilling. Eleanor had not been targeted at random. She had been watched, selected, studied. Yet again, nothing concrete emerged. Years passed. The city changed. Buildings were demolished. Streets were renamed. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and some key figures died, carrying their secrets into the grave. Eleanor's parents passed away within 2 years of each other, never knowing what happened to their daughter. Her brother moved abroad, trying to outrun a past that refused to let go. But the case remained. A single folder on a shelf. Yellowed pages. Faded photographs. A life reduced to paperwork. Until technology caught up with time. In 2019, the Metropolitan Police launched a massive cold case review program, digitizing thousands of unsolved files, applying modern forensic tools to crimes once thought beyond reach. Eleanor Walsh's case was among them. What investigators found would reopen wounds that had never healed and expose a truth buried beneath 41 years of silence. The scarf. The clothing fibers. Trace particles once dismissed as contamination. Tiny fragments of skin preserved on a broken fingernail. Back in 1978, they meant nothing. In 2019, they became a voice. DNA analysis revealed a partial profile. Incomplete. Fragile. But enough to enter into the national database. Weeks passed. Then months. And then, one quiet morning in February, an alert flashed across a computer screen in a small forensic lab outside London. A partial match. Not a name. Not yet. but a familial link. A genetic echo pointing toward a man in his 60s, living under a different surname, working as a delivery contractor in the Midlands. A man with no criminal record, no visible connection to Eleanor Walsh, and a past that appeared clean. Detectives hesitated, because cold cases do not usually end like this. But they follow the thread. And what they uncovered would send shockwaves through Britain, forcing a nation to confront the terrifying possibility that a killer had lived undetected in plain sight for more than 4 decades. Unseen, unquestioned, waiting. The alert did not make a sound. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just a quiet line of text appearing on a monitor in a sterile forensic lab, its meaning so heavy it seemed to bend the air around it. A partial familial DNA match. Not enough to name a killer. Not enough to close a case. But enough to tear open a wound sealed for 41 years and let the past come rushing back. Detective Inspector Martin Hargreaves stared at the screen for a long time before he spoke. A veteran of cold cases, he had learned to distrust hope. Too many times, promising leads had dissolved into nothing. Too many times, excitement had been followed by disappointment. But this time felt different. This time, the data was precise. The probability of coincidence was vanishingly small. Somewhere in the Midlands lived a man genetically linked to the unknown person whose DNA had been found on Eleanor Walsh's body. The name attached to the record was Daniel Mercer, 64 years old, divorced, no children, employed as a regional delivery contractor, driving long distances between industrial depots. No criminal convictions. No arrest record. A quiet existence. The kind of man who leaves no trace. At first glance, he did not fit any profile. No violent history. No pattern of abuse. No known connection to London in 1978. But the deeper detectives dug, the more the surface began to fracture. Mercer had been 22 in 1978, the same age as Eleanor. He had lived in East London for 6 years, in a rented room less than a mile from the Blue Lantern Cafe. He had moved abruptly in early 1979, leaving behind unpaid rent and no forwarding address. And his employment history showed a troubling gap beginning just weeks after Eleanor disappeared. The silence around those missing months was deafening. Surveillance began quietly. Unmarked cars, long lenses, digital monitoring of phone records and financial transactions. Mercer lived alone in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of Coventry, surrounded by overgrown hedges and rusted fencing. His routines were mechanical. Wake at 5. Drive deliveries until late afternoon. Return home. Eat. Watch television. Sleep. He spoke little to neighbors. Avoided eye contact. Kept to himself. Nothing about his behavior screamed guilt. And yet, detectives could not shake the feeling that they were orbiting something enormous, something buried deep beneath decades of careful normality. They needed more DNA. But in the United Kingdom, obtaining a direct DNA sample without probable cause was impossible. They would have to be patient. They would have to wait for him to discard something. A cigarette, a coffee cup, a tissue, anything that carried the invisible signature of his identity. So they followed him. Days stretched into weeks. Rain washed across the windshield of unmarked vehicles. Cold seeped into bones. Surveillance officers rotated shifts, documenting every movement, every habit. Mercer drove hundreds of miles each week, delivering industrial parts, warehouse supplies, and sealed packages. His routes crisscrossed the country. Sometimes he spent nights in roadside motels. Sometimes he returned home long after midnight. Then, on a damp Thursday evening, he stopped at a service station outside Northampton. He bought a coffee, drank it slowly in his van, tossed the cup into a bin. A plainclothes officer retrieved it moments later, sealing it inside an evidence bag with gloved hands. The cup was rushed to the lab. The wait began. 48 hours later, the result came back. A direct match. The DNA on Eleanor Walsh's fingernail belonged to Daniel Mercer. For a moment, the room fell silent. There are discoveries that bring relief. And then there are discoveries that feel like a punch to the chest. This was the latter. Because confirmation did not bring closure. It brought terror. A man connected to a brutal murder had walked free for 41 years, building a life so ordinary it defied suspicion. The arrest warrant was approved within hours. They moved at dawn. Mercer opened his front door to a row of dark figures, weapons lowered but ready, badges catching the pale light. His face registered confusion, then irritation, then something far more fleeting and far more disturbing. Recognition. A flicker of understanding. And then it was gone, replaced by the practiced emptiness of someone who had spent a lifetime hiding. He did not resist. Inside the bungalow, officers found nothing overtly incriminating. No weapons. No bloodstains. No hidden trophies. Just a meticulously tidy home. Bare walls. Minimal furniture. A stack of old magazines. A single locked cabinet in the spare room. Inside it, a bundle of yellowed papers. Receipts. Letters. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a newspaper clipping from October 1978. The headline screamed in bold ink, "Student vanishes in East London. Police baffled." Eleanor's face stared up from the page. During interrogation, Mercer remained calm, polite, almost helpful. He acknowledged knowing Eleanor, claiming they had spoken occasionally at the cafe. He denied harming her, denied following her, denied any involvement. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he paused, as if calculating, then suggested contamination. A coincidence. A lab error. His voice never wavered. But the past does not stay buried forever. Investigators revisited old witness statements, now armed with a name. They found a retired shop owner who, after decades of silence, admitted something he had never told police. On the night Eleanor disappeared, he had seen her speaking to a man outside his store. A tall man, narrow face, dark hair. He had been standing beside a delivery van. When shown a photograph of Daniel Mercer taken in 1978, the old man began to tremble. He nodded once. Slowly. That was him. Another witness, a former bus driver, remembered an argument near Adler Street. The man had been aggressive, grabbing the woman's arm, pulling her toward a side road. At the time, the driver had assumed it was a lover's quarrel. When he saw Mercer's face, he closed his eyes. It all came rushing back. The timeline began to solidify. Eleanor had not vanished. She had been intercepted, coerced, taken. But where? That answer remained locked inside Mercer's silence. Detectives pressed harder. They laid out the evidence. The DNA. The witnesses. The circumstantial web tightening around him. For hours, he said nothing. He stared at the table, at the wall, at the one-way mirror, his breathing steady, controlled, as if waiting for something. Finally, he spoke. He did not confess. Instead, he told a story. He claimed Eleanor had asked for a ride, claimed she was frightened, claimed he had tried to help, that she had panicked in the van, struck her head, and died by accident, that he had been terrified, that he had disposed of the body in a moment of madness. A tragic misunderstanding. A life ruined by fear. But the injuries told a different story. The fractures, the pattern of trauma, the marks on her wrists, the violent end that water could not erase. It was not an accident. It was not a moment. It was an act. And yet, Mercer clung to his narrative, refusing to provide details, refusing to say where the attack occurred, refusing to reveal how her body reached the River Lea. Each question met with a wall of carefully constructed ambiguity. The prosecution prepared for trial, but a shadow loomed over everything. Time. Evidence had decayed. Witnesses had died. Memories had blurred. The defense argued contamination, coincidence, misidentification. They argued that a conviction based on fragments and recollections was dangerous. That justice delayed could become justice distorted. The courtroom became a battlefield between past and present, truth and doubt. And as the trial date approached, something unexpected happened. A woman in her 70s contacted the police. Her voice shook as she spoke. She had been afraid for 40 years. She had lived with the knowledge every day, and she could not stay silent anymore. She had known Daniel Mercer in 1978, and she had seen something that night. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and for more than 4 decades, she had carried a secret so heavy it bent her spine, carved lines into her face, and hollowed the sound of her voice. When detectives arrived at her small terraced house on the outskirts of Birmingham, they found a woman who looked far older than her 73 years, her hands trembling as she poured tea she could not bring herself to drink. The walls around her were lined with photographs of children and grandchildren, moments of joy frozen in time, standing in stark contrast to the nightmare she had buried in silence. In 1978, Margaret had been 19, a shop assistant by day, a cleaner by night. She rented a room in the same dilapidated building as Daniel Mercer, 3 floors below him. They were not friends, barely acquaintances. They exchanged polite nods on the staircase, brief comments about the weather, nothing more. To her, he had been just another quiet tenant, a man who smelled faintly of engine oil and cigarettes, who avoided conversation and kept his door firmly closed. Until the night Eleanor Walsh vanished. Margaret had been returning from a late shift shortly after 10. The fog was thick, the street almost deserted. As she turned into the narrow service road behind their building, she heard raised voices. A man's low, urgent tone. A woman's sharp intake of breath. She slowed, heart thudding, instinctively shrinking back into the shadows. She saw a van, parked at an awkward angle, its rear doors slightly open. A woman struggling near the side. A man gripping her arm, forcing her forward. The woman's scarf slipped loose, fluttering to the wet pavement. For a split second, Margaret considered screaming, running, intervening. Instead, she froze. The man glanced up. Their eyes met. In that instant, something passed between them. A silent transaction of fear and recognition. Margaret would later say she saw calculation in his gaze. Assessment. Decision. Then he shoved the woman inside the van, slammed the doors, and drove off, tires spitting water across the darkened street. Margaret stood there long after the noise faded, her body rigid, her mind numb. She picked up the fallen scarf, clutching it like proof that what she had seen was real. But by the time she gathered the courage to contact the police the next morning, the building buzzed with rumors. Eleanor Walsh had disappeared. Posters were already being printed. Panic filled the air. Margaret tried to convince herself she had imagined it, that the fear had twisted a mundane scene into something monstrous. She told no one. Not then. Not later. Not when she moved away weeks afterward. Not when the body was found. Not when the newspapers screamed murder. She carried it alone. For 41 years. Until she saw Daniel Mercer's arrest on the news. The sight of his face, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same, shattered the dam. Sleep deserted her. The past surged back with brutal clarity. And with it, the crushing realization that her silence had allowed a killer to walk free. Her statement changed everything. It placed Mercer at the center of Eleanor's final moments. It anchored the abstract DNA evidence in living memory. It gave shape to the darkness that had long been only a theory. And it opened a new line of inquiry, one that led detectives back to the building where it had all begun. The old structure had been demolished in the late 1980s, replaced by a modern apartment complex. But city records preserved its blueprint. Investigators studied every inch, reconstructing the internal layout, mapping stairwells, storage rooms, service corridors, and communal basements. Their focus narrowed to a single area, a locked maintenance cellar beneath the building, accessible only through a door hidden behind stacked crates. Former tenants were tracked down. Many were elderly. Some refused to speak. Others claimed faulty memory. But one man, now living in a care home, remembered something unsettling. In early 1979, shortly after Eleanor's disappearance, a foul smell had begun to seep from the cellar. Complaints were made. The landlord ordered a cleanup. The stench vanished. No one had ever checked what caused it. Armed with this new information, Forensic teams excavated the ground beneath the modern complex, drilling through concrete and soil in a painstaking process that stretched over weeks. It was a desperate gamble, driven more by intuition than certainty. Then they found something: fragments of fabric, degraded beyond recognition, yet chemically consistent with fibers from Eleanor's clothing. Microscopic traces of blood embedded in the soil. And beneath that, a patch of ground darker than the surrounding earth, saturated with organic residue. The cellar had been the first crime scene. Eleanor had not been taken directly to the river. She had been brought inside, held, assaulted, and ultimately killed within meters of where Margaret had stood frozen in terror. The evidence tightened the net. But the most devastating discovery lay elsewhere. A financial investigator reviewing Mercer's old employment history noticed a curious pattern. In the years following Eleanor's death, Mercer had worked briefly for multiple logistics companies, often quitting abruptly. Each move coincided with the disappearance of a young woman along his delivery routes. Cases scattered across the country. Different police forces. Different decades. Different circumstances. But all shared haunting similarities. Late-night vanishings, minimal witnesses, bodies found near waterways, unresolved investigations. Cold cases. Too many to ignore. A task force was assembled, pooling data from 5 jurisdictions. Names emerged. Dates aligned. Routes overlapped. Slowly, a terrifying possibility took shape. Eleanor Walsh might not have been Mercer's only victim. She might have been the first. Or merely the first to speak from the grave. As the scale of potential crimes expanded, public reaction exploded. News outlets seized the story. Headlines screamed of a serial predator hidden in plain sight. Families of long-missing daughters flooded police lines, desperate for answers, terrified of confirmation. Each new DNA test carried the weight of hope and horror intertwined. In a cell, Mercer withdrew further into himself. He refused additional interviews, declined legal counsel changes, spent hours staring at the wall. Guards reported he barely slept, pacing the length of his cell in the early hours, whispering to himself in fragmented phrases no one could decipher. Then, 3 weeks before trial, he attempted suicide. Found unconscious on the floor, wrists slashed with a fragment of broken plastic, he was rushed to hospital under heavy guard. He survived. But the message was clear. The pressure was cracking the shell he had worn for a lifetime. When he regained consciousness, detectives were waiting. This time, he asked for water. Then he asked for paper. And finally, in a voice barely louder than breath, he said he was ready to talk. The room was stripped of warmth. White walls, a steel table, 2 chairs, a single camera mounted in the corner, its unblinking lens waiting to record history. Daniel Mercer sat hunched forward, wrists bound, hospital band still clinging to his skin, the faint smell of antiseptic lingering around him. His face looked smaller now, as if the weight of 41 years had finally collapsed inward. His eyes were bloodshot, hollow, stripped of defiance. For the first time since his arrest, the mask was gone. He did not look at the detectives when he began to speak. His voice came out low, uneven, a brittle thread unraveling from deep inside his chest. He said he remembered the night clearly. Too clearly. The rain. The fog. The smell of damp brick and diesel fumes. The electric buzz of fear and anticipation crawling beneath his skin. He said he had been watching Eleanor for weeks, memorizing her shifts, tracing her walk home, learning the rhythm of her life until it felt like his own. He said he never planned to kill her. He only wanted control. To feel power. To prove, if only for a moment, that he mattered. The words landed like ice. He described parking the van near the cafe, pretending to fix an engine problem, waiting for her to pass. He said he stepped into her path, spoke gently, asked for directions. When she hesitated, he touched her arm. When she recoiled, fear flaring in her eyes, something inside him snapped. He forced her into the vehicle, drove fast, heart pounding, mind racing, every sense sharpened by adrenaline. He claimed he took her to the cellar because it was hidden, because no one ever went there, because the door had a broken lock no one bothered to repair. He said he tied her hands with a piece of rope he kept in the van, that she screamed, that she begged, that he shouted for her to be quiet, terrified of being heard, that he struck her when she wouldn't stop. He paused then. For a long time, his breathing turned ragged. His shoulders trembled. When he continued, his voice was barely audible. He said she hit her head on the concrete floor, hard, that the sound echoed in the small room like a gunshot, that she lay still, blood pooling beneath her hair, that he waited, shaking, hoping she would move. When she didn't, panic consumed him. He said he stayed there for hours, trapped between disbelief and horror, until the sky began to lighten outside. By dawn, he was no longer thinking, only reacting. He wrapped her body in plastic sheeting, carried her to the van, and drove east, away from the city, away from memory, away from himself. He followed back roads, avoiding checkpoints, until he reached the River Lea. He dragged her through the reeds and let the water take her, watching until the current swallowed every trace. Then he drove home and washed the van. He said he thought it was over, but it wasn't, because something inside him had awakened. The next years unfolded in fragments of confession, each more disturbing than the last. He spoke of urges that returned in waves, growing stronger, darker, more insistent. Of fantasies that invaded his sleep. Of a hunger for fear, for control, for dominance. He said Eleanor's death did not frighten him away from violence. It taught him how to hide it. He began choosing victims along his delivery routes. Women alone at night, students, shift workers, travelers stranded between destinations. Each disappearance crafted to look accidental, impulsive, unconnected. Different locations, different methods, different disposal sites. A deliberate effort to avoid patterns. He described luring them with offers of help. Rides, shortcuts, warmth, safety. And when they trusted him, he took everything. As he spoke, detectives sat motionless, recording every word, every tremor, every shift in tone. Each confession reopened old wounds, linked forgotten names, resurrected unresolved grief. Cold cases from the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, all suddenly breathing again. By the time he finished, his statement stretched over 200 pages. 12 victims. Possibly more. Some remains had never been found. Some identities had never been confirmed. And for the families who had lived in limbo for decades, the truth arrived like a storm, ripping away hope and replacing it with certainty too heavy to bear. News of the confession exploded across the country. Front pages carried Eleanor Walsh's face once more, now alongside the image of the man who had haunted her final moments. Television panels debated how such a predator could remain invisible for so long. Commentators demanded answers. How had he evaded detection? How many warning signs had been missed? How many chances had there been to stop him? The police reopened files nationwide. Teams combed through boxes of yellowed reports, cross-referencing timelines, locations, witness statements. New searches were launched. Divers returned to rivers. Cadaver dogs traced old routes. Excavations began in forgotten fields, abandoned warehouses, derelict farms. And slowly, painfully, the lost began to surface. A fragment of bone here, a piece of jewelry there. A faded shoe lodged beneath river silt. Each discovery a brutal confirmation. Each identification a moment of devastation and release for families who had waited their entire adult lives for an answer. But even as the body count grew, one question refused to fade. Why Eleanor? Mercer's confession painted her as the catalyst, the spark that ignited his descent. Yet investigators sensed something more. Something unfinished. Something unresolved. They returned again to Margaret Holloway, the witness who had seen the abduction. They asked her to revisit every detail, every memory, no matter how small. It was then she remembered the argument. Before the struggle, before the van doors slammed shut, she recalled Eleanor saying a name. Not shouting, not pleading, but speaking it. A single word. Daniel. The room fell silent, because Eleanor had not been approached by a stranger. She had recognized him. Detectives searched through Eleanor's diary, her letters, her university notes, her cafe schedules. Buried within mundane entries, they found small references. A man who lingered too long after ordering coffee. Someone who waited outside after closing. A face that appeared again and again, never named, never described in detail, only hinted at through phrases like "that man again, the one who watches, he followed me to the station." Eleanor had been afraid, and she had been right to be. This revelation reframed everything. The crime was not opportunistic. It was deliberate, calculated, stalked. A slow tightening of a net that had closed around her long before she ever noticed. And somewhere in Mercer's meticulous planning lay the reason she had been chosen. A reason he had not yet revealed. As the trial approached, prosecutors prepared to present not just a case, but a reckoning. The courtroom would become the stage upon which decades of silence, denial, and buried truth would finally collide. But outside, beyond the walls of justice, the shadow of the past still loomed. Because even with confessions, even with DNA, even with witnesses and remains, the story was far from complete. And the darkest chapter had yet to be spoken. The files were old, brittle, their edges curled like dead leaves, stained by decades of dust and neglect. They had been stored in a forgotten archive beneath a county building in northern England, untouched since the early 1960s. No one had thought to look for them before. No one had known they mattered. But now, as investigators traced Daniel Mercer's life backward, peeling away the layers of the man he had pretended to be, those files began to speak. And what they revealed was a childhood steeped in silence, fear, and cruelty. Daniel Mercer had not always been Daniel Mercer. He was born Daniel Hargan in 1956 in a decaying industrial town scarred by unemployment, alcoholism, and violence. His father, Thomas Hargan, was a dock worker with a reputation for rage. His mother, Margaret Hargan, was a seamstress who rarely spoke above a whisper. Their home was a two-room terrace soaked in the smell of stale smoke and boiled cabbage, its walls thin enough to transmit every argument, every blow, every scream. Neighbors would later recall the sounds at night. Crashes. Shouting. The dull thud of fists meeting flesh. A child crying until the noise abruptly stopped. Social services intervened several times. Each visit ended the same way. Polite apologies. Promises of reform. Closed doors. And then the cycle resumed. From the age of 7, Daniel learned the art of invisibility. He learned how to stay quiet, how to avoid eye contact, how to disappear into corners when his father's footsteps thundered down the hallway. He learned that pain was inevitable and that survival depended on obedience and emotional detachment. At school, he was isolated, bullied, mocked for his unkempt clothes and withdrawn manner. Teachers described him as intelligent but disturbingly detached. He rarely spoke. When he did, his words were precise, clipped, devoid of emotion. Classmates said his stare made them uncomfortable, that he watched people the way hunters watch prey. One report from a school counselor in 1968 described him as exhibiting early signs of emotional disassociation and predatory fixation. The document was filed, forgotten. By 14, he had begun stealing. Small items at first. Coins, tools, trinkets. Then animals began to disappear from the neighborhood. Stray cats, dogs left unattended, a farmer's lamb found mutilated in a field. No one could prove anything. No charges were ever filed. But whispers followed him like a shadow. At 16, his mother vanished. Official records listed her departure as voluntary. A woman leaving an abusive marriage. But there was no trail. No job. No relatives. No confirmed sightings. She simply disappeared. And Daniel never spoke of her again. 2 years later, his father died in what police classified as a workplace accident. A fall from a loading platform. blunt force trauma to the skull. Witnesses claimed he slipped, but one dock worker privately told investigators that the injuries looked more like a blow than a fall. The statement went nowhere. Daniel left town within weeks. He changed his surname. He became Mercer. He erased his past. By the time he arrived in London in the mid-1970s, he was a blank slate. A young man with no criminal record, no family ties, and no visible scars. He worked odd jobs, slept in shared flats, observed, learned, adapted. He built a new identity brick by brick, hiding the rot beneath a veneer of ordinariness. But the past had not loosened its grip. Psychological experts later concluded that Mercer's upbringing had forged a personality capable of extreme compartmentalization. He could separate violence from daily life with surgical precision. To coworkers, he was polite, distant, unremarkable. To neighbors, invisible. To strangers, harmless. And beneath it all, a dormant storm waiting for release. Eleanor Walsh became that release. Investigators revisited her background, searching for any point of intersection. At first, nothing surfaced. Different social circles, different neighborhoods, no shared friends, no obvious connection. But then they found the library. Both Eleanor and Mercer had frequented a small public library near Whitechapel. She went to study. He went to read technical manuals and newspapers. Their visits overlapped repeatedly across several months. Staff remembered Eleanor complaining once about a man who stared at her from across the room, making her uncomfortable. She stopped going soon after. That was likely the beginning. A silent fixation. A predator choosing his prey. Mercer's confession had hinted at control, at dominance, at power. But beneath those words lay something deeper. Resentment. Envy. Rage. Eleanor embodied everything he was not. Young. Educated. Surrounded by friends. Moving forward, she represented escape. A future. A life beyond fear. And he could not tolerate that. Experts would later describe his psychology as a volatile fusion of childhood trauma and emerging sadistic tendencies. Violence was not merely an act. It was communication, a way to impose his internal chaos onto the world. Once Eleanor was gone, the barrier shattered. The killings escalated. Yet each was wrapped in meticulous care. Mercer learned from mistakes. He studied police methods. He altered patterns. He switched routes. He varied disposal sites. He embraced mobility as camouflage, embedding himself within the endless movement of logistics networks, forever in transit, forever untraceable. But no matter how far he traveled, London remained the epicenter of his memory. The cellar, the van, the rain, the moment everything changed. That was why he kept the newspaper clipping, not as a trophy, as a reminder of who he had become. During the trial, prosecutors unveiled his history piece by piece, dismantling the persona of the quiet delivery contractor. Jurors listened in stunned silence as childhood abuse, vanished parents, early cruelty, and escalating violence formed a relentless narrative of dissent. Yet, even as the case against Mercer solidified, the defense prepared a final gambit. They would argue insanity, that Mercer's traumatic upbringing had fractured his mind beyond repair, that his actions were the product of compulsion, not malice, that he lacked full awareness of his crimes. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered. What they uncovered only deepened the horror. Mercer was not delusional. He was not disconnected from reality. He understood his actions. He planned them. He enjoyed them. One psychiatrist wrote a single line that would echo throughout the courtroom. Mr. Mercer does not kill because he is broken. He kills because he chooses to. As the trial date loomed, tensions across the country surged. Survivors' families gathered outside the courthouse, holding photographs, candles, and handwritten signs demanding justice. Media coverage intensified, transforming the proceedings into a national reckoning. And through it all, Eleanor Walsh's name rose once more to the forefront, not as the first victim, but as the one who finally shattered the silence. The woman whose last struggle would expose a killer hiding in plain sight. the woman who would not be forgotten. Yet even as her story neared resolution, investigators uncovered a final, chilling possibility. One more disappearance. One more unsolved cold case. One that predated Eleanor. And one that might prove she had not been the beginning at all. The file was thin.
Too thin.
Just a few brittle pages clipped together, their ink faded to a sickly gray. A missing persons report dated March 1975. 3 years before Eleanor Walsh vanished. 3 years before Daniel Mercer officially arrived in London. 3 years before anyone believed the nightmare had begun. Her name was Claire Donovan. She was 19, a trainee nurse, recently moved from a rural town to the city, chasing independence, ambition, and a life larger than the one she had left behind. On the evening of March 3, 1975, she finished a late shift at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, boarded a bus toward her shared flat, and was never seen again. At the time, police classified her disappearance as voluntary. No struggle, no witnesses, no immediate sign of violence. Her belongings were missing. A letter discovered in her room hinted at dissatisfaction, longing, restlessness. The conclusion came quickly. Claire had run away. The case was closed. But as investigators now pored over the details, patterns emerged. Disturbing, unavoidable. The bus route, the drop-off point, the narrow streets, the poorly lit service roads, the proximity to industrial garages and loading bays. The overlap with Daniel Hargan's known movements during his final years under that name. Back then, he had worked part-time at a freight depot, less than half a mile from Claire's route home. Witnesses were long gone. CCTV non-existent. Forensic technology primitive. But the echoes were there, whispering across time. Investigators tracked down Claire's younger sister, now living in a coastal town in Wales. She was 63, her hair silver, her eyes permanently shadowed by grief that never softened. When detectives mentioned Mercer's confession, her hands began to shake. She told them something she had never told police. 2 weeks before Claire disappeared, she had mentioned a man who followed her after work. A van driver.
Quiet. Polite.
Insistent. He offered rides. Help. Protection from the dark streets. Claire had declined. But she had noticed him again and again, waiting near the hospital gates, leaning against a vehicle, pretending to read. She described his face. When shown Mercer's photograph from the 1970s, she began to cry. The same eyes. The investigation reopened at once. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed near the old freight depot. Excavations began in forgotten lots, beneath concrete poured decades earlier. Divers searched industrial canals. Cadaver dogs combed overgrown fields that had once been empty ground. For weeks, nothing. Then, beneath a derelict warehouse slated for demolition, they found disturbed earth. A shallow grave. Inside it, skeletal remains wrapped in fragments of decayed plastic and cloth. A corroded bracelet still clung to a fragile wrist. Claire Donovan had been found. The confirmation shattered any remaining illusions. Eleanor Walsh had not been the beginning. She had been the moment when Mercer refined his methods, when he crossed from impulsive violence into systematic predation. And now, the true scale of his crimes stretched further back into the shadows. Each new discovery reignited public outrage. How many chances had there been to stop him? How many warning signs had been ignored? How many lives might have been saved if one file had not been closed, if one report had not been dismissed, if one witness had spoken sooner? The weight of institutional failure settled heavily over the investigation. For Margaret Holloway, the witness who had remained silent for 41 years, the guilt became unbearable. She wrote a letter to Eleanor's brother, now living in Canada, apologizing for her fear, for her paralysis, for her silence. He wrote back, telling her that blame belonged only to the man who had stolen his sister's life. But the words did little to ease her torment. Because silence had a cost. And now, everyone was paying it. As the trial approached, Mercer's confessions expanded. He began to draw maps. Crude sketches. X marks in forests, beside rivers, near abandoned structures. Each mark represented a possible burial site. Each location sent search teams racing against time, weather, and decay. Some yielded nothing. Others yielded bones. In total, 14 sets of remains were eventually recovered. 14 families received confirmation. 14 lives were finally acknowledged. And still, investigators suspected the true number was higher. In court, prosecutors built their case like a cathedral of evidence. DNA, witness testimony, confessions, forensic reconstructions, behavioral analysis. Every element locked into place, forming an overwhelming portrait of guilt. But the defense clung to one argument.
Time.
They argued that memories were unreliable, that evidence degraded, that confessions could be coerced, that a fair trial after 4 decades was impossible, that Mercer was being condemned by hindsight. The courtroom became a crucible. Families filled the public gallery, clutching photographs, whispering names, bracing themselves for testimony that reopened wounds they had spent lifetimes trying to seal. Journalists crowded every bench. Sketch artists worked furiously, capturing moments that would soon be splashed across front pages. And at the center of it all sat Daniel Mercer. Motionless.
Silent.
Watching. When he finally took the stand, the room seemed to contract around him. He spoke softly, deliberately, weaving his narrative of accident, compulsion, and fractured memory. He claimed remorse, claimed confusion, claimed he no longer fully understood what he had done. But when the prosecution played recordings of his detailed confessions, when they displayed maps in his own handwriting, when they showed the jury images of the recovered remains, his composure began to fracture. Small cracks, a tightening of the jaw, a twitch in the fingers, a flicker of anger behind his eyes. And in that flicker, something terrifying emerged. Not regret, not sorrow, but resentment. Resentment at being caught. Resentment at losing control. Resentment at the collapse of a life built on secrecy. For the families watching, that expression cut deeper than any admission of guilt, because it revealed the truth. The monster had never vanished. It had simply learned to hide. As the trial neared its conclusion, the nation waited. Streets fell silent during broadcasts. Offices paused. Schools whispered. For many, this was more than a criminal case. It was a reckoning with the idea that evil could blend so seamlessly into everyday life. And beneath that fear lay another question. If Mercer had gone undetected for so long, how many others like him were still out there? Still waiting. Still watching. Still patient. The courtroom felt smaller as the verdict approached. Air thickened. Breaths shortened. Every bench was filled. Every aisle crowded. Every wall lined with cameras and security. Outside, reporters clustered behind metal barriers, their voices bleeding through the glass in a constant, restless murmur. London waited. The country waited. Decades of unanswered grief pressed inward, demanding resolution. Inside, 12 jurors sat motionless, their faces pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For weeks, they had absorbed a torrent of horror.
Names. Dates.
Photographs. Confessions. Forensic diagrams. Audio recordings of sobbing relatives. Each day had stripped away another layer of emotional armor, leaving them raw, exposed, and burdened by a responsibility few could truly comprehend. And in the center of it all sat Daniel Mercer. He looked smaller than before, shrunken, folded inward. The once meticulous calm that had defined him now fractured by tension and sleeplessness. His hands trembled faintly on the table. His jaw clenched and unclenched in slow, rhythmic spasms. He did not look at the families. He did not look at the jury. He stared straight ahead, as if the wall before him held some final refuge from judgment. The prosecution rose first. Their closing argument did not shout. It did not rage. It spoke quietly, deliberately, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle like a suffocating blanket over the room. They walked the jury back through Eleanor Walsh's final night.
The fog.
The cafe. The narrow streets. the van, the cellar, the river. They traced the arc of violence outward, from one life extinguished to 14, perhaps more, until the pattern became undeniable. They spoke of choice. They spoke of control. They spoke of the meticulous care with which Mercer had hidden his crimes, adapting, evolving, learning. Not the actions of a man lost in compulsion, but of a predator refining his craft. They ended with Eleanor's name. They asked the jury to remember her not as a victim, but as the catalyst for truth. The woman whose death cracked open 40 years of silence, exposing a darkness that had consumed so many others. When the defense stood, their tone shifted. They spoke of trauma, of abuse, of a childhood poisoned by violence, of a mind warped long before it reached adulthood. They argued that Mercer's life had been shaped by forces beyond his control, that the seeds of destruction had been planted early, nurtured by neglect, indifference, and brutality. They pleaded for mercy. They asked the jury to see a broken man, not a monster. But mercy had become a fragile concept in that room. As the judge delivered instructions, the jurors filed out, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. The wait began. Minutes stretched into hours. Families clutched one another. Some prayed. Some stared blankly ahead. Some wept in silence. For them, the verdict could not restore what had been taken. It could not rewind time. It could not resurrect daughters, sisters, mothers. But it could name the truth. And sometimes, naming the truth was all that remained. Behind the scenes, security tightened. Threats had flooded in from across the country. Some demanded vengeance. Others demanded death. The atmosphere around the courthouse grew electric, charged with emotion, fear, and expectation. At 4:17 p.m., the jury returned. The room rose as one. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The foreman stood, hands shaking, eyes fixed on the paper before him. His voice cracked as he spoke. On the charge of murder, guilty. A sob tore through the gallery. Then another. Then dozens. The sound swelled, a wave of grief and release crashing against the walls. On the remaining counts, guilty. 14 times the word echoed, each repetition a hammer striking the final nail into the coffin of Mercer's anonymity. Daniel Mercer did not react. He did not flinch. He did not bow his head. For a long moment, he simply sat there, staring ahead, as if the words had failed to penetrate the fortress of his mind. Then slowly he exhaled. A single breath. Controlled. Measured. Almost relieved. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. In the days that followed, the nation dissected every detail. Psychologists debated his profile. Politicians demanded reforms. Advocacy groups called for expanded cold case funding, for DNA databases, for witness protection, for trauma-informed policing. Eleanor Walsh's name became a symbol, a rallying cry for justice delayed and finally delivered. But for the families, the victory was hollow. They gathered in private, sharing memories, photographs, stories of laughter and childhood, and dreams interrupted. They built a fragile community out of shared loss, bound together by the knowledge that no one else could truly understand what they had endured. For Eleanor's brother, standing alone by the Thames, the river that had hidden his sister for nearly a year, the verdict brought neither peace nor closure. Only a quiet exhaustion. He scattered white petals onto the dark water, watching them drift away, whispering a goodbye he had rehearsed for 4 decades. Inside his prison cell, Mercer prepared for sentencing. Psychiatric evaluations continued. Security increased. His movements were monitored. Yet something about his demeanor unsettled the guards. He appeared calmer now, centered, as if a burden had lifted. Then, 2 nights before sentencing, he requested paper and pen. What he wrote would alter everything. The letter was addressed not to the court, not to his lawyers, not to the families. It was addressed to the police. And in it, he described a place no one had ever searched. A location far from cities, far from roads. A place where, he claimed, the truth had been buried deeper than anyone imagined. When detectives read the letter, A chill spread through the room. Because if Mercer was telling the truth, then even now, even after 14 confirmed victims, the full extent of his crimes had yet to be revealed. And Eleanor Walsh's story, the story that had ignited this reckoning, was about to lead them one final time into the darkness. The letter was only 2 pages long, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, each line measured, each word placed with unsettling precision. It described a place called Blackwood Hollow, a remote stretch of forest in North Yorkshire, far from towns, far from main roads, a forgotten scar in the landscape where peat bogs swallowed sound and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Mercer claimed that beneath its waterlogged soil lay the remains of those who had never been counted, never reported, never missed loudly enough to matter. Detectives read the letter in silence. Then they read it again. Coordinates were included. Distances measured from landmarks long since abandoned. Subtle clues hidden in phrasing, guiding the reader toward a narrow trail that branched off from an overgrown forestry track. Mercer wrote as if mapping a memory he had walked many times in his mind. Not with remorse, but with ownership. Within hours, a task force was assembled. Forensic archaeologists, search and rescue specialists, crime scene analysts, and cadaver dog units converged on the region. The journey north felt like a descent into another world. Urban sprawl gave way to empty moorland, gray skies stretching endlessly above dark, rolling hills. Roads narrowed. Mobile signals vanished. Civilization receded until only silence remained. Blackwood Hollow emerged from the fog like a wound in the earth. The forest was dense, tangled, its branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath was treacherous, a shifting mosaic of mud, moss, and hidden pools. The air smelled of rot and rain. Sound died quickly, absorbed by thick vegetation and heavy clouds. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter. Search teams moved carefully, marking each step, mapping every square meter. Dogs strained against their leashes, noses low, tails rigid, drawn toward invisible trails buried beneath decades of decay. Hours passed, then days. Nothing. Doubt crept in. Had Mercer lied one final time? Had this letter been nothing more than a cruel gesture, a way to maintain control even from behind bars? Pressure mounted. Media helicopters circled overhead. Journalists speculated. Families waited, suspended between hope and dread. Then, late on the third evening, a dog stopped. Its handler froze. The animal circled a patch of ground near the base of a fallen tree, barking sharply, digging at the soft soil. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Forensic markers went up. Lights were positioned. Tools came out. And slowly, carefully, investigators began to excavate. At less than a meter down, they struck fabric. Then bone. The remains were tightly wrapped in layers of plastic and rope, preserved by the cold, acidic peat. Jewelry lay against fragile fingers. A pendant engraved with the name Sarah still glinted faintly beneath the dirt. Sarah McKenna had vanished in 1983. She had been 17. Her case had never been linked to Mercer. Her disappearance had been attributed to teenage rebellion, a girl running from home. Her parents had died without answers. Her younger sister, now a grandmother, would receive the news alone. Over the next 10 days, 6 more burial sites were discovered within a 1-mile radius. Each carefully concealed. Each painstakingly unearthed. Each revealing another lost identity, another life erased and forgotten. The total victim count rose to 21. The nation reeled. But Mercer's letter hinted at more. References to the river bend, the old quarry, the place where trains once slept. Cryptic phrases, incomplete maps, memories fragmented by time, or perhaps deliberately obscured. Investigators followed every lead, pushing deeper into forgotten spaces, reopening sealed tunnels, dredging silted canals, excavating collapsed structures. Some searches yielded nothing. Others uncovered only fragments. And with each passing day, the realization grew heavier. Even now, some would never be found. Even now, some families would never know. When confronted with the discoveries, Mercer remained eerily composed. He answered questions with clinical detachment, correcting coordinates, clarifying directions, offering precise details that left detectives chilled. He spoke of burial depths, soil types, decomposition rates. Knowledge accumulated through repetition, through experience. It became clear that for him, these acts were not impulsive. They were rehearsed, perfected, ritualized. Psychiatrists later described his mindset as one of complete emotional detachment. He did not see victims. He saw variables, problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. Yet beneath that cold logic lay something else. Possession. Every location, he described, carried personal significance, a memory, a moment, a private archive of violence stored across the countryside. And by revealing them, he reclaimed control of the narrative, forcing the world to walk through his past on his terms. But in doing so, he triggered something he could not predict. Public fury reached unprecedented levels. Demonstrations erupted outside prisons, courthouses, and government buildings. Families demanded sweeping reform. Cold case funding skyrocketed. DNA databases expanded. Laws governing evidence preservation were rewritten. Police training underwent radical overhaul. Witness protection protocols strengthened. For the first time, the nation confronted the staggering cost of institutional indifference. And at the center of that reckoning stood Eleanor Walsh. Her name became synonymous with the awakening. The moment the machinery of justice lurched back to life after decades of dormancy. Her story was taught in police academies. Her case cited in parliamentary debates. Her photograph displayed in campaigns advocating for missing persons. She had become more than a victim. She had become a turning point. As sentencing day approached, the courtroom braced itself for a final confrontation. Families prepared statements. Prosecutors refined arguments. Judges reviewed precedent. Security measures intensified. The gravity of the moment pressed upon every participant. Because this would not be a routine sentencing. It would be history. And yet, beneath the formal gravity of the law, another truth lingered. For all the evidence, all the confessions, all the remains recovered from dark soil and darker water, one fundamental mystery remained unresolved. What had truly driven Daniel Mercer? Was it trauma? Was it hatred? Was it obsession? Or was it something more elemental, more terrifying, a void where empathy should have lived? The answer, when it finally came, would arrive not through testimony, not through science, not through reason. It would arrive through his final words. The courtroom had never felt so heavy. Every seat was filled. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, some clutching photographs worn thin by years of grief, others holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Journalists crowded the back rows, their pens hovering above notepads, waiting for words that might define a generation of horror. Armed officers lined the walls, their presence a reminder that even now, even here, the weight of danger had not entirely lifted. Daniel Mercer was led in under heavy guard. He looked different.
Smaller.
More fragile. The sharp edges of his composure had dulled, replaced by a hollow stillness that seemed to swallow light. His hair had thinned. Deep lines etched his face. His eyes, once alert and calculating, now drifted slowly across the room, as if taking inventory of every gaze, every whisper, every tremor of emotion. When his eyes met those of the families, he did not look away.
He studied them.
The judge entered. The room rose. Silence fell. Sentencing proceedings began. The prosecution summarized the magnitude of Mercer's crimes, recounting each life, each disappearance, each fragment of evidence recovered from soil and water. Names filled the air like a litany. Eleanor Walsh, Claire Donovan, Sarah McKenna, and the others. 21 confirmed victims. Possibly more. A timeline of devastation stretching across nearly 5 decades. Each name landed like a blow. The judge spoke of accountability, of moral responsibility, of the irrevocable harm inflicted. He spoke of the enduring consequences, not only for the victims and their families, but for a society forced to confront its own blind spots. He described Mercer's actions as a sustained campaign of predation, characterized by meticulous planning, emotional detachment, and profound cruelty. Then he turned to the defense. They spoke of trauma, of cycles of abuse, of a childhood scarred beyond repair. They argued for life imprisonment with a possibility of parole, citing psychiatric evaluations that detailed the depth of Mercer's psychological damage. They spoke of the human capacity for change, however remote. Few in the room believed them. When they finished, the judge leaned forward. And for the first time, he addressed Daniel Mercer directly. "Is there anything you wish to say before sentence is passed?" The question hung in the air, fragile and electric. For several seconds, Mercer remained motionless. Then slowly he rose. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. He placed his hands on the table, steadying himself, and drew a long breath. When he began to speak, his voice was calm.
Too calm.
He said he had listened to every word. He said he understood the weight of what he had done. He said he knew no sentence could balance the scale. But then his tone shifted. He spoke not of regret. He spoke of memory. He said he remembered Eleanor Walsh more clearly than any other victim. He remembered the sound of her footsteps on wet pavement, the smell of her perfume mingling with diesel fumes, the way she had tried to reason with him, her voice trembling but defiant. He said her fear had been different, sharper, more alive. A ripple of anger surged through the gallery. The judge warned him to choose his words carefully. Mercer nodded, but continued. He said Eleanor had looked at him as if she saw something beneath the surface, something monstrous. And that look, he claimed, had stayed with him, haunted him, challenged him. He said it had forced him to confront the reality of who he was, long before anyone else did. Then he said something that froze the room. He said Eleanor had not begged for her life.
She had demanded to know why.
The question, he said, had echoed in his mind for decades.
Why?
Why her? Why anyone? Why he had become what he was? He paused, his eyes drifting upward, as if searching the ceiling for an answer. And then he said it. "I wanted to feel real." The words fell flat, stripped of emotion, devoid of theatricality. And yet, they struck deeper than any confession. He said that after a childhood of invisibility, of being beaten, ignored, erased, violence had been the only thing that made him feel present.
Alive.
He said fear reflected in another person's eyes gave him a sense of existence no other experience had ever provided. He did not cry. He did not tremble. He simply stated it, as if describing a physical law. For the families, the explanation offered no solace. It did not restore. It did not heal. It only illuminated the abyss from which his actions had emerged. The judge interrupted. He reminded Mercer that the courtroom was not a stage, that this was not a forum for philosophical reflection, that the purpose of the moment was justice. He then delivered the sentence. Whole life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. No prospect of release. The words reverberated through the chamber.
Some gasped.
Some wept. Some closed their eyes, as if absorbing the finality of it all. Mercer nodded once. A small gesture. Acceptance, perhaps. Or resignation. As he was led away, a woman in the front row stood. It was Eleanor Walsh's childhood friend. Her voice rang out, trembling but fierce. "You took everything from her, but you didn't erase her. You made her unforgettable." Mercer did not turn. The doors closed behind him with a muted thud. And just like that, 41 years of silence ended. But the story did not. In the weeks that followed, memorials appeared across the country. Candles flickered beneath photographs. Flowers piled against iron gates. Names long absent from public memory resurfaced, spoken aloud, honored, reclaimed. Eleanor's grave, once rarely visited, became a place of pilgrimage. Strangers left notes, letters, poems, apologies, promises, each offering a fragment of collective mourning. Cold case units received unprecedented funding. DNA technology expanded. Training programs multiplied. Missing persons protocols were rewritten. And slowly, painstakingly, other forgotten cases began to stir, lifted from darkness by the momentum of Eleanor's legacy. Yet even as society moved forward, one final shadow remained. Because in Mercer's letter, beneath the coordinates and cryptic phrases, investigators had noticed something else. A line, barely visible. A sentence scratched so faintly it almost escaped detection. I am not the only one. At first, they dismissed it as manipulation. A last attempt to sow fear, to maintain relevance. But the more they examined his history, his movements, his associations, the more unsettling the possibility became. What if Mercer had not acted entirely alone? What if, somewhere, someone else carried the same darkness? And what if the silence, now broken, had only begun to speak? The silence did not end with the arrest. It deepened. It thickened. It spread like a heavy fog across the city, clinging to brick walls, seeping into doorways, settling in the lungs of those who had waited decades for this moment. London held its breath as the suspect sat behind steel and glass, his name finally spoken aloud, his face finally exposed, his life finally unfolding under the harsh, white light of interrogation rooms. But answers did not come easily. They never did. Not in a case that had learned how to survive on shadows. Inside the holding cell, the man stared at the concrete floor, his hands folded, his breathing slow, controlled, mechanical. Detectives watched from behind mirrored glass, searching for cracks, for tremors, for any sign that the past was clawing its way back to the surface. His records were thin.
Too thin.
A series of temporary jobs. Short-term leases. Frequent relocations. A man who never stayed long enough to be known. A ghost drifting through post-war Britain, leaving almost nothing behind but questions. His name triggered no immediate recognition in the public. No headlines from the past. No mugshots in dusty files. But when investigators dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. In 1978, he lived less than 8 minutes from the crime scene. In 1979, he vanished from London entirely. No forwarding address. No formal departure. Just a sudden disappearance, as if he had sensed the tightening net and slipped through its final opening. His DNA had not existed in any national database until a minor arrest in 2019, a bar fight in Manchester, a broken bottle, a brief scuffle, a few drops of blood on a pub floor. At the time, it meant nothing. Just another sample in an endless system. But years later, when the cold case unit reopened the 1978 file, when forgotten evidence was finally tested using modern technology, those few drops of blood rewrote history. The match was not partial. It was not inconclusive. It was absolute. A statistical certainty so overwhelming it left no room for doubt. 1 in trillions. A fingerprint across time. A voice reaching out from the dead. And suddenly, a murder that had slept for 40 years screamed back into the present. When confronted with the DNA results, the suspect did not react. No shock. No denial. No visible fear. His expression remained blank, his eyes hollow, like windows into a room that had long ago been emptied. He asked for water. He adjusted his posture. He waited. The first interview lasted 7 hours.
He spoke little.
He answered questions with careful precision, offering fragments of memory, disconnected details, half-finished thoughts. He remembered the street. He remembered the pub. He remembered the rain. He remembered walking late at night. But he did not remember blood. He did not remember screams. He did not remember a knife. Detectives pressed harder. They showed him photographs. The crime scene. The alley.
The body.
Still, nothing. No emotional response. No visible disturbance. Just a slow blink. A long breath. A whispered, "I don't know." But investigators knew better. They had studied this case too long. They recognized the pattern. The psychological barricade. The deliberate mental erasure. A survival instinct honed over decades. A man who had spent 40 years rehearsing his innocence, repeating it in his own mind until it felt real. So they changed tactics. They stopped asking about the crime. They asked about his life, his childhood, his parents, his first job, his first heartbreak. Slowly, carefully, they built a timeline, a psychological map, a portrait of a man shaped by instability and fear. Raised in a violent household, a father who drank, a mother who disappeared, foster homes, institutional care, early signs of aggression, petty theft, street fights, short sentences, long silences, a life defined by displacement, a boy who learned that survival meant vanishing before anyone could pin you down. And then in 1978, something snapped. Or perhaps something finally aligned. A chance encounter. A dark alley. A woman walking alone. A moment of uncontrollable rage. Or something colder. Something planned. Something ritualistic. The suspect's silence became heavier as the questions drew closer to the night itself. His hands began to tremble.
Barely.
Almost imperceptibly. But the cameras caught it. The microphones heard the change in his breathing. The room tightened. Time slowed. Finally, after 12 hours across 2 days, the first fracture appeared. He asked, "What if I don't remember it the way you do?" The room froze. Detectives leaned forward. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. He stared at the wall. His voice dropped to a whisper. "What if I remember pieces, but not the whole?" They waited. Outside, the rain returned, drumming against windows like a distant applause. Inside, the past began to stir. He spoke of walking that night, of feeling restless, of anger with no clear target, of voices in his head, a buzzing pressure that would not stop. He spoke of fear, of control, of needing something to break. He remembered following someone. He remembered a struggle. He remembered a scream that cut through the dark like glass. Then silence.
Long.
Unbroken. Finally, he said, after that, everything went quiet. But he would not say her name. He would not say what he did.
He would not cross that final line.
The confession hovered in the air, incomplete, fragile, unresolved. And for the families, for the investigators, for a city that had waited for decades, that was not enough. Public reaction exploded. News outlets ran continuous coverage. Faces of the victim reappeared on screens across the country. The old photographs, grainy, faded, frozen in time, now felt unbearable. A young woman, smiling, unaware that her future would end in a narrow alley under flickering streetlight. Her family, long aged, long broken, forced to relive the moment they had spent their lives trying to escape. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Some carried candles. Others carried signs. Justice delayed is justice denied. Remember her. Never forget. The city transformed into a living memorial. But beneath the surface, doubts began to ripple. Defense attorneys challenged the DNA chain of custody. They questioned the storage conditions. They attacked the timeline. They suggested contamination, procedural flaws, bureaucratic negligence. They argued that 40 years of delay had destroyed the possibility of a fair trial. And in that legal gray zone, fear returned. What if he walked free? What if the case collapsed again? What if the truth vanished a second time? Inside the courtroom, the air felt electric. Every movement, every word, every pause carried unbearable weight. Experts testified about genetic markers, probability thresholds, forensic advancements. They explained how modern science had resurrected a voice long buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. The defense countered with skepticism,
Statistics.
uncertainty,
Doubt.
but then something unexpected surfaced. A witness, a man in his 70s, trembling as he approached the stand. In 1978, he had been a night bus driver. He remembered a figure running. He remembered blood on a jacket. He remembered a face. He had never come forward. Too afraid. Too unsure. Too young. But now, with the suspect's image broadcast everywhere, Recognition struck like lightning. He pointed. His voice shook. That's him. The courtroom inhaled. A single finger collapsed decades of silence. The suspect lowered his eyes. For the first time, his composure cracked. A tear slid down his cheek. And in that moment, something irreversible occurred. The walls he had built inside himself began to collapse. The confession came late that night, recorded in a dim interrogation room, under a single hanging light. His voice barely audible. His words fragmented. But the meaning was unmistakable. He admitted to the attack, to the rage, to the fear, to the aftermath. He described the knife, the panic, the running, the endless nights haunted by the same scream. 40 years of silence shattered in a single breath. But closure did not arrive. Not fully. Because even as the truth emerged, it exposed deeper wounds. Why had the evidence been ignored for so long? Why had early witnesses never been followed up? Why had key reports been lost? Why had technology been allowed to advance for decades before anyone bothered to look again? The answers were ugly. Budget cuts, staff shortages, bureaucratic failure, human error, a system overwhelmed, a case quietly abandoned. The realization hit harder than the crime itself. This was not just one man's darkness. It was institutional neglect. And the consequences were irreversible. Families who had died waiting. Lives spent in unanswered grief. A murderer who walked free for 40 years. The city reckoned with its own reflection. London 1978 was no longer just a murder. It became a symbol of justice delayed, of voices ignored, of the fragile line between truth and oblivion. And even as the trial moved forward, even as sentencing loomed, even as the legal machinery prepared to close the final chapter, something unsettled lingered in the air. Because the suspect's confession contained gaps, missing hours, unexplained movements, shadows still unaccounted for, fragments of memory that refused to align. And in those fractures, a chilling question persisted. Was he alone? Or had the truth only just begun to surface? The silence returned. But now it sounded different, heavier, more dangerous. As if the case, even in its resolution, was warning everyone that some mysteries never truly end. They only wait for the next crack in time. The verdict did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with a whisper, slipping into the courtroom like a breath held too long, settling over the rows of faces, sinking into the bones of everyone who had gathered to witness the end of a story that had refused to die.
Guilty.
One word, spoken softly, yet carrying the weight of 4 decades. The sound of it rippled outward, touching the families, the journalists, the detectives, the strangers who had come simply to see if justice could still exist after so much time. Some wept openly. Others closed their eyes. A few stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if the human mind could not yet accept that this chapter had finally been sealed. The man in the dock did not react. His shoulders remained slumped, his hands resting motionless in his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For him, the moment felt strangely distant, as if the verdict belonged to another person, another life, another era. 40 years of denial, suppression, and psychological barricades had built a fortress inside his mind, and even now, as the world declared him guilty, that fortress did not collapse. It merely echoed. Outside, London exhaled. News alerts flashed across millions of screens. Radio hosts paused mid-sentence. Office conversations stopped. Buses rolled past digital billboards announcing the verdict in bold, unforgiving letters. A city that had grown, transformed, rebuilt itself countless times since 1978 suddenly felt anchored to a single point in the past. For a brief moment, the decades compressed, and London remembered who it had been, darker, more uncertain, more afraid. The victim's name was spoken again, not as a footnote, not as a cold statistic, but as a human presence returning to public consciousness. Her photograph circulated widely, her youthful face glowing with life that had been stolen too soon. Strangers left flowers near the alley where she had died, an unremarkable strip of pavement now transformed into sacred ground. Candles burned through the night, their small flames trembling in the winter air, fragile yet defiant. But even in this moment of apparent closure, something uneasy stirred beneath the surface. Because closure, when delayed for 40 years, does not arrive cleanly. It arrives tangled. The sentencing hearing drew crowds larger than the trial itself. Survivors of other unresolved cases came, carrying their own silent hopes, watching carefully, as if the outcome here might predict their own futures. Detectives who had worked the case decades earlier sat in the back rows, their faces etched with exhaustion and regret. Some had retired. Some had lost colleagues. Some had buried memories they never expected to exhume. The prosecutor spoke of accountability. The defense spoke of mental illness, trauma, broken systems. The judge listened. And when the sentence was finally delivered, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, a murmur swept through the room, half relief, half sorrow. The man was led away without resistance. The sound of his footsteps faded down a sterile corridor. A door closed. A lock turned. And with that, one life vanished from the world, while another, long extinguished, flickered painfully in remembrance. Yet the case refused to rest. In the weeks that followed, journalists uncovered details long buried in forgotten archives. Early witness statements that had never been pursued. Evidence logs that made no sense. Reports stamped incomplete. Interviews abandoned halfway through. A pattern emerged, not of conspiracy, but of collapse. A police force stretched too thin. A system overwhelmed by rising crime, limited technology, and political pressure. In 1978, London was a city fighting fires on every front. And somewhere in that chaos, one woman's murder had slipped through the cracks. The public reaction shifted. From celebration to anger. From relief to accusation. Questions flooded social media, newsrooms, and parliamentary offices. How many other cold cases were still gathering dust? How many families were waiting for answers that might never come? How many killers had simply walked away? The government announced an independent inquiry. Files were reopened. Budgets were reallocated. Cold case units expanded. Technology deployed. A promise was made. No case would be forgotten again. But promises, like memories, fade. And those who had lived inside this nightmare for decades knew better than to trust words alone. The victim's family held a private memorial service, far from cameras and microphones. Just a small gathering, beneath gray skies, where stories were shared, tears were shed, and silence was allowed to breathe. They spoke of birthdays missed, weddings that never happened, children who were never born. Entire futures erased in a single violent act. For them, justice did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. A long war finally ending, leaving behind only scars. And still, the unanswered questions lingered. The suspect's confession, though damning, remained incomplete. Certain details did not align with forensic findings. His timeline wavered. Some movements remained unexplained. Detectives suspected that fear, shame, or psychological fragmentation had distorted parts of his memory. Others wondered if he had shielded someone else. A companion, a witness, an accomplice. No evidence ever confirmed it. No second arrest followed. But doubt, once planted, refuses to die. At night, in quiet flats and crowded homes, people replayed the story in their minds, trying to reconstruct the final moments in that alley. They imagined footsteps, breath, shadows. They searched for meaning in the darkness, for logic in chaos, for comfort in resolution that never quite came. The alley itself was transformed. New lights were installed. Surveillance cameras mounted. The walls repainted. Time attempted to erase the stain. But those who knew the story swore the air felt heavier there, as if memory itself had seeped into the bricks. Years passed. The headlines faded. New crimes replaced old ones. But the case of London 1978 remained a benchmark, a reminder of both failure and redemption, of horror and perseverance, of the terrifying endurance of truth. For the detectives who reopened the file, the victory felt fragile. They understood that every solved case illuminated countless unsolved ones, each waiting patiently in the dark. And they knew that behind every dusty folder lay a family, suspended in grief, clinging to hope. One of them described it best: solving a cold case does not end a story. It merely changes who must carry it. And so the story continued. In classrooms, where criminology students studied the file as a lesson in forensic evolution. In police academies, where recruits were warned never to underestimate the power of time. In courtrooms, where defense and prosecution alike cited it as precedent. In homes, where parents held their children a little closer. And in the quiet corners of memory, where the victim's life persisted, fragile yet unextinguished. Because in the end, this was never just about catching a killer. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been silenced. About reminding the world that no matter how long darkness reigns, truth has a way of resurfacing.
Slowly.
Relentlessly. Inevitably. And as London moved forward, rebuilt itself yet again, reshaped its skyline, reinvented its identity, the echo of that night in 1978 remained, whispering through time, through generations, through the endless corridors of human memory. A reminder, a warning, a promise that no secret is ever truly safe, that no crime is ever completely forgotten, that somewhere in the shadows of the past, the truth is always waiting for the moment when silence finally breaks. Time did not heal the wound. It only taught the city how to live with it. In the months after the trial, London moved forward with the mechanical precision of a place that had learned to survive tragedy. Trains still thundered through underground tunnels. Neon lights still flickered in rain-soaked streets. Pubs still overflowed with laughter and spilled beer. But beneath the familiar rhythm, something had shifted. Conversations softened when the case was mentioned. Footsteps slowed near the alley. Eyes lingered on shadows a second longer than before. The story had embedded itself into the bloodstream of the city. For the detectives who had carried the case across decades, retirement brought no peace. Some woke in the middle of the night, convinced they had missed something, their minds replaying old photographs, forgotten statements, half-remembered details. Others avoided sleep entirely, haunted by the possibility that the truth they had uncovered was still incomplete. They gathered occasionally in quiet cafes, speaking in low voices, dissecting every element, every timeline gap, every inconsistency that refused to settle. Because even after the confession, even after the conviction, doubt remained. The suspect had admitted to the act, yet certain forensic elements still resisted explanation. Fibers recovered from the victim's coat did not perfectly match any item found in his possession. Footprints in the alley suggested more than one set of shoes. A witness from 1978 had reported hearing two voices, overlapping, urgent, chaotic, a detail dismissed at the time as confusion, fear, imagination. Now it resurfaced, and it refused to be ignored. The cold case unit reopened its internal investigation, quietly, cautiously, away from the public eye. They returned to archived files, reanalyzed evidence, retraced movements, reconstructed timelines with modern software. Surveillance did not exist in 1978, but data modeling allowed them to simulate traffic flows, pedestrian density, and environmental noise. Patterns emerged. Probabilities sharpened. Possibilities multiplied. And slowly, an unsettling narrative began to take shape. The suspect may not have been alone. The idea was dangerous. It threatened to fracture the fragile sense of closure the city had fought so hard to reclaim. If an accomplice existed, that meant someone else had walked free. Someone else had blended back into society. Someone else had carried the secret for 40 years. Someone else might still be watching. A name surfaced. Not from DNA. Not from fingerprints. but from an overlooked interview conducted 2 days after the murder. A bartender, young at the time, now in his 70s. He had described 2 men leaving the pub shortly before closing. One nervous, one calm, one restless, one composed. They argued briefly, then stepped into the rain together. One of them matched the suspect. The other did not. The description was vague, incomplete, unreliable by modern standards. But it was enough to reopen a door that should have remained sealed. The second man, whoever he was, vanished from records shortly after 1978. No criminal history. No known address. No traceable employment. A blank space in bureaucratic systems that were never designed to track ghosts. Detectives nicknamed him the Shadow. And as they dug, the shadows deepened. Fragments emerged. A railway ticket purchased under a false name. A cash withdrawal in a different borough. A landlord who remembered a quiet tenant who paid on time and asked no questions. Each clue led to another dead end. Each lead dissolved into uncertainty. The shadow became a symbol, not of a person, but of everything that could never be fully known. Publicly, authorities denied the possibility of an accomplice. Official statements insisted the case was closed. Justice served. Truth established. But internally, the question gnawed relentlessly. Had they truly uncovered the whole story, or only the part that survived? Meanwhile, the victims' families struggled to reconcile their relief with the lingering discomfort. They had waited so long for answers, for accountability, for resolution. And now, when it had finally arrived, it felt fragile, conditional, vulnerable to collapse. They avoided interviews. They declined documentaries. They retreated into privacy, choosing memory over spectacle. Yet strangers continued to send letters, messages, tokens of sympathy, stories of their own unresolved losses. The family became unwilling symbols of endurance, of patience, of grief stretched across generations. And through them, the case lived on. In universities, criminologists dissected the investigation as a blueprint for cold case methodology. In police academies, recruits were trained using its failures and triumphs. In forensic laboratories, scientists refined techniques inspired by the breakthroughs that had cracked it open. London 1978 became more than a crime. It became a turning point, a warning, a challenge. Years passed. Technology advanced. Artificial intelligence entered forensic analysis. Facial recognition algorithms combed through decades of archived footage, searching for patterns once invisible to human eyes. Data mining software cross-referenced millions of records, reconstructing movements, predicting associations, revealing hidden networks. And then, quietly, without announcement, a match appeared. Not conclusive, not definitive, but intriguing enough to reignite the investigation. A blurred figure captured in a 1978 traffic camera, standing near the alley just minutes before the murder. At the time, the image had been too degraded, too indistinct to matter. Now, enhanced, sharpened, reconstructed pixel by pixel, a face began to emerge. Not clear, but familiar. The software generated probability models, comparing the face against decades of identification databases. One result rose above the rest. A man who had died 10 years earlier. A dock worker. A minor offender. A resident of London's East End. Someone who had lived unremarkably and died unremarkably, but whose presence in that alley changed everything. His records showed proximity to the suspect. Shared workplaces. Shared pubs. Shared social circles. Connections that individually meant nothing. Together, they whispered of complicity. The discovery was explosive. Too explosive to release. Authorities debated for weeks, weighing the consequences. Revealing a potential accomplice, long dead, would reopen wounds, destabilize public trust, and offer no path to prosecution. Yet suppressing the information risked perpetuating the very failures that had allowed the crime to remain unsolved for so long. In the end, they chose silence. The official narrative remained intact. One killer, one conviction, one resolution. But inside police archives, the files continued to grow. Annotations, addenda, digital reconstructions, alternate timelines, a shadow investigation into a shadow suspect. And thus, the case entered a strange new phase, solved, yet unresolved, closed, yet still alive. At night, in the quiet corridors of Scotland Yard, screens glowed with images from 1978. Faces blurred, streets reconstructed, simulations replayed endlessly. Algorithms tested infinite variations of a single moment in time, searching for certainty in chaos. But certainty never arrived. Only probability, only doubt, only the relentless echo of unanswered questions. The man convicted of the crime aged rapidly in prison. His health deteriorated. His hair whitened. His body shrank inward, as if attempting to disappear. He refused further interviews, declined psychological evaluations, rejected appeals. In rare moments of candor, he spoke only of dreams, recurring visions of rain, footsteps, and a scream that never faded. He died quietly, alone, one winter morning. With him, whatever fragments of truth he still carried vanished forever. The city marked his passing with silence. No headlines, no public statements, only a brief notice in a prison registry. And yet, something shifted again. Because death, unlike conviction, cannot be cross-examined. It seals secrets. It locks doors permanently. And in that finality, the unresolved elements of the case hardened into permanent mysteries. Years turned into decades. London transformed once more. Skyscrapers rose where warehouses once stood. Neighborhoods gentrified. Generations passed. But the story endured. It resurfaced in late-night podcasts, in investigative books, in documentaries narrated in hushed tones, each retelling adding new layers, new theories, new interpretations. Each generation inheriting the same haunting question. Did we ever truly know what happened that night? Or did we only accept the version we could bear? Because the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that truth is rarely singular. It is fractured, distorted, filtered through fear, memory, trauma, and time. And in that distortion, certainty becomes a luxury. The alley remains, a narrow passage between brick walls, unremarkable, easily overlooked. Yet those who know its history feel the weight of invisible footsteps, the residue of a moment that forever altered countless lives. Some pause. Some whisper prayers. Some turn away quickly. All carry something with them afterward. A subtle unease. A lingering chill. A reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, darkness waits patiently. And that sometimes, even when justice finally arrives, it does not bring peace. Only deeper questions. Because in the end, the London 1978 cold case did not simply teach the world how to solve old crimes. It taught something far more unsettling. That time does not erase truth. It buries it, compresses it, twists it, and when it finally resurfaces, decades later, it rarely returns whole. It returns fragmented, unstable, haunted, leaving behind not closure, but echoes. Echoes that travel endlessly through memory, through history, through the collective conscience of a city that will never fully escape the night when silence first fell.